You're making the worst mistake of your life, Charlotte. Her cousin Margaret gripped her arm at the station platform, voice low and furious. You're throwing yourself away on a nobody, a dirt-poor cowboy who can't even afford a proper suit. Charlotte pulled free. She picked up her own bag. She stepped onto the train. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, tucked between a gas bill and a condolence card that still smelled faintly of someone else's lavender perfume. Charlotte Bennett had been sitting at the kitchen table of her late father's house in Boston, the one that no longer felt like home, now that the man who had made it home was gone, and she had almost thrown the envelope away without opening it. She was glad she didn't. His name was Thomas Reed. He lived somewhere in the mountain valleys of Colorado Territory, on a ranch he described without flattery or embellishment. He had responded to a notice placed in a correspondence journal by Charlotte's neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Farnsworth, who had taken it upon herself to help Charlotte find a suitable situation after the funeral, a phrase that, coming from Eliza, meant a husband. Charlotte had been humiliated when she found out. She had stormed over to Eliza's house in the rain, knocked so hard her knuckles ached, and told the woman in no uncertain terms that she was not a parcel to be forwarded to a stranger. But Eliza had simply handed her the letter. "Read it first," Eliza said. "Then be angry." Charlotte read it standing in Eliza's parlor, still dripping from the walk over. Miss Bennett, it began without any of the courtly preamble she might have expected from a man trying to impress someone. "My name is Thomas Reed. I am 31 years old. I own a working cattle ranch in the San Luis Valley of Colorado Territory, approximately 60 miles south of Pueblo. I am writing because I am looking for a wife, and Mrs. Farnsworth, whom I understand is your neighbor, was kind enough to share your situation with me. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending the circumstances are glamorous. The ranch is not wealthy by any measure. The work is hard. The winters are long and isolating. I do not have a lot to offer in terms of comfort or luxury. What I can offer is this: I am honest. I work every day. I will never lie to you, strike you, or disrespect you. I believe a marriage should be a partnership between two people who tell each other the truth. If that matters to you, I would be glad to correspond further." That was it. No poetry, no promises, no performance. Charlotte folded the letter, handed it back to Eliza, and walked home in the rain. She read her copy 3 more times before bed. She wrote back the following morning. What followed was 4 months of letters that arrived at Charlotte's door like a lifeline she hadn't known she was reaching for. Thomas Reed wrote the way some men talked, slowly, carefully, as though he measured every word before committing it to paper. He asked her real questions. What did she enjoy reading? What had her father been like? Did she believe in God? And if so, what did she think he expected of people? What frightened her? Charlotte answered honestly because something about his directness made dishonesty feel small. She told him about the debt her father had left behind, hidden carefully from the family, until after the funeral, when the attorney had read the numbers aloud, and Charlotte had felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She told him about her cousin Gerald, who had been circling ever since with his polished shoes and his well-meaning offers, suggesting she move in with his family, suggesting she sell the house, suggesting she marry his business associate, a man named Howard Pratt, who was 54 years old, twice widowed, and who had looked at Charlotte across a dinner table like she was a problem he was already solving in his head. Thomas had written back, "A man who sees a woman's difficulty as an opportunity for himself is not a man who sees the woman at all." She had read that sentence so many times the paper softened along the crease. By June she had agreed to marry him. By July she had begun to understand that agreeing and going were 2 very different things. The morning she left Boston, Gerald was at the station. He was not there to wish her well. He stood on the platform in his gray wool suit with his hat in his hands, and he spoke to her in the tone he reserved for situations he believed he was managing. "You're being reckless," he said. "You don't know this man. You've never even met him. He could be anyone." "He could be," Charlotte agreed, checking her ticket. "Charlotte." Gerald stepped closer. "Howard Pratt has offered a very generous arrangement. You would be comfortable, secure. You wouldn't have to worry about what? She looked at him steadily. About being poor, about working hard, about not having everything handed to me. She picked up her bag. I've been worried about those things my whole life, Gerald. I'm not afraid of them. You haven't seen what real hardship looks like. No, she said, but I've seen what it looks like to sell yourself to avoid it. I'd rather not. She stepped onto the train before he could answer. She did not cry until Kansas. The journey west took 9 days by rail with a final leg by stagecoach that rattled her spine and coated every surface of her clothing in red Colorado dust. The landscape changed so gradually that she almost missed the moment it stopped looking like anything she recognized. The trees grew sparse, then scarce. The sky opened up in a way that felt less like freedom and more like exposure, as though the land were watching her with the same skepticism she was watching it. Thomas had arranged for her to be met at the relay station in a town called Harlow Crossing, which was the closest settlement to his property. He had told her a man named Pete Dunbar, his ranch hand, would be waiting with a wagon. What she had not anticipated was arriving to find a half-dozen men loitering near the station, the way men loitered in small western towns, not doing anything in particular, but watching everything. She stepped down from the stagecoach, pulling her carpet bag behind her, and felt 12 pairs of eyes land on her at once. A thin man with sun-cracked skin and a hat that had been rained on too many times stood apart from the others. He held up one hand when he saw her. Miss Bennett. Yes. Pete Dunbar. I work for Mr. Reed. He took her bag before she could argue. Wagon's just here. Long ride ahead. She followed him. Behind her she heard someone say, not quietly, that the woman Reed sent for, another voice lower, must be desperate. She kept walking. Pete didn't acknowledge that he'd heard it. He stowed her bag in the wagon bed, helped her up to the bench, and clicked his tongue at the horses before she'd fully settled. Is it very far? She asked. Hour and a half, give or take. He glanced sideways at her. Depending on the road. Is the road often worse than expected? His mouth twitched. Almost always. She decided she might be able to trust Pete Dunbar. He didn't speak much during the ride, which suited her. She needed the time to prepare herself. Thomas had been truthful in his letters, she had never doubted that, but truthful wasn't the same as complete, and she was aware that she had filled in the spaces between his words with details drawn from her own imagination. She had done that with everything she couldn't see. The ranch house she'd pictured something modest but sturdy neat. The land open and clear, the way the valley looked in drawings she'd seen in Harper's Weekly. Thomas himself tall, she'd decided, though he'd never mentioned it. Quiet, steady. His face serious but not unkind. She had no reason to believe any of that was accurate. The wagon crested a long rise, and she saw the ranch for the first time. Her hands tightened in her lap. The house was real enough. 2 stories, weathered gray timber. A porch that listed slightly to the left where a post had settled into soft ground. The barn behind it was large and serviceable. There were outbuildings scattered at practical distances, a corral with several horses moving in the dust, a well with a rope pulley that looked older than anything else on the property. It was not what she'd imagined. What she'd imagined had been poor. This was poorer. She breathed in slowly through her nose and reminded herself what she'd told Gerald at the station. She had meant those words. She intended to keep meaning them. Pete pulled the wagon up beside the porch and stopped. A man came around the corner of the house. He was wiping his hands on a cloth that had already given up any ambition of cleanliness. He wore a canvas work shirt worn through at both elbows and trousers that had been mended at the knee. His boots were the kind of boots that told you everything about a man's relationship with the word later. They needed resoling and had needed it for some time. He stopped when he saw her. He tucked the cloth into his belt. How was not what she'd imagined either. He was taller than she'd decided, and broader in the shoulders, with the particular build of a man who had worked outdoors every day of his adult life. His face was weathered, his dark hair needed cutting, and his jaw carried several days of growth that might have been a beard in early formation, or might simply have been neglect. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "I'm Thomas Reed." "Mr. Reed." She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he released her hand before it became anything more than a greeting. "You're tired," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine." "The room is ready. Pete will bring your things." He turned back toward the house. "Supper's at 6. That was it. No romantic declaration. No acknowledgement of the strangeness of the situation. Two people who had written each other intimate truths for 4 months now, standing in the same space of air for the very first time. He simply assumed she needed rest, told her when supper was, and went back to whatever he had been doing before she arrived. Charlotte stood where she was for a moment, watching him disappear around the side of the house. Well, she thought, how was exactly what his letters had promised? She just hadn't understood until this moment how much easier a thing is to admire on paper than to live with in person. The room he had prepared for her was small and spare a bed, with a quilt that had been washed so many times. The colors had gentled into something almost pretty. A chest of drawers, a basin and pitcher, one window that faced east. On the windows, someone had placed a small glass jar with 2 yellow wildflowers in it. She stood looking at those flowers for longer than she meant to. They had not come from a florist. They had come from wherever wildflowers grew on this land, picked by someone who had thought to pick them, which meant someone had thought of her. That small evidence of consideration sat in her chest like a warm coal in a cold room. She unpacked one bag, washed her face, and sat on the edge of the bed. She was 26 years old, in a state she had never visited, in a house she had never seen, engaged to a man she had only just met. Her father was dead. Her family home would be sold by winter. The man she was supposed to marry had not bothered to say welcome, had not smiled when he saw her, and had already returned to his work before she had finished gathering herself. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. She had made this choice. She would not spend it feeling sorry for herself. She went downstairs before 6 to see if there was anything she could help with. The kitchen was small and functional. Every inch of it, organized with the precision of someone who had cooked alone for a long time and knew exactly where everything was and exactly why. Thomas was at the stove. He did not hear her on the stairs, and for a moment she stood in the doorway, watching him move, efficient, unhurried, each action deliberate. He was not the kind of man who wasted motion. "I can help," she said. He turned. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'd like to." A pause. He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not unfriendly, but assessing as though he were measuring something against some private standard. "Biscuits," he said. He nodded toward the counter where a bowl and flour sack were already waiting. "Pete likes them." "Do you?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything, but it was something. "Yes." She made the biscuits. He made a stew with beef from his own cattle and vegetables from a root cellar she hadn't yet seen. They ate with Pete at the kitchen table, and Pete asked her most of the questions: where she was from, how long the journey had taken, whether she'd ever been this far west before. Thomas ate and listened, and occasionally corrected Pete when Pete got something factually wrong, which happened twice, and Pete took the correction each time with the tolerance of a man who was accustomed to being corrected and had made his peace with it. After supper, Pete excused himself. Charlotte began clearing plates. Thomas said, "You don't need—" "If you say that again," she said pleasantly, "I'm going to assume you're trying to tell me I'm a guest rather than someone who lives here, and I'm going to ask you which one it is, because I'd like to know." He was quiet for a moment. "You live here," he said. "Then I'll clear the plates." He let her. Later. When the kitchen was clean and the lamps were burning low, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him and a pencil in his hand. She had assumed she'd be left to herself for the evening, but when she said good night and moved toward the stairs, he looked up. "It's harder than you expected," he said. Not a question, not an apology, just an acknowledgement. She stopped on the first step. "Yes. Most things worth doing are." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who was now her husband. By written contract and church record, though, no ceremony had yet been performed. This stranger who had told her the exact truth about what she was walking into, and whom she had still been unprepared for. "Did you pick the flowers?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Yes." She nodded once. "They're very nice." She went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she finally did, it was with the quiet understanding that whatever this man was, he was not a liar. And in her experience, that was rarer than most people admitted. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. Not the chaotic scramble she'd braced for, but something spare and disciplined, like a piece of music played in a very simple key. Thomas was up before she was. By the time she came downstairs, he had already fed the horses, checked the cattle, and started the kitchen stove. He left coffee on the heat without being asked, which she noticed on the third morning, and had to decide not to think too much about, because thinking too much about small kindnesses from a quiet man was dangerous business. She found her place in the household by trial and observation. Thomas did not direct her. He did not suggest tasks or offer instruction unless she asked. He simply moved through the work of the ranch and allowed her to figure out where she fit, which she initially found maddening, and then gradually came to respect as a form of trust. He was not testing her. He was giving her room. She started with the kitchen and the house, then the chickens. Then she began helping Pete with the heavier work, carrying feed-mending, tack-keeping records that Pete maintained in a system so idiosyncratic it had ceased to function as a system at all. When she reorganized the supply ledger and showed Pete the result, he stared at it for a long moment and then said, "Huh," with the particular inflection of a man who had just discovered that life could be made simpler. Thomas noticed. She saw him look at the ledger that evening, and then look at her, and then look back at the ledger without saying anything. The next morning, he left a second ledger on the kitchen table with a note, "Livestock records." Same problem. She fixed it. She left it on the table for him to find. The morning after that, there was a third ledger. She laughed genuinely for the first time since she'd arrived, and it surprised her so much she put her hand over her mouth. She was starting to understand him. Not his secrets, not his history, but his language, the way he communicated in objects and tasks and small deliberate gestures rather than words. The wildflowers in the jar, the coffee on the stove, the ledgers left where she'd find them. It was not romance. It was not even warmth exactly. It was something more structural than that, the recognition of one capable person by another, offered in the only currency he seemed to know how to spend. She was not sure yet whether she could love that, but she was beginning to think it deserved respect. 3 weeks in, she encountered her first real test of character, and it was not the ranch that provided it. A woman named Vera Calloway came to call on a Wednesday afternoon, which Charlotte had come to understand was the day when the wives of nearby ranches occasionally visited one another. Vera was perhaps 40, handsome, well-dressed by local standards, and possessed of the particular social ease that comes from having been the most interesting woman in a small community for a very long time. She looked at Charlotte across the kitchen table with frank, unapologetic appraisal. "So you're the one Thomas sent for," she said, not unkindly, more the way one might examine a new piece of equipment to assess its fitness for purpose. "I suppose I am. Where are you from?" "Boston." Vera's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Boston. And you agreed to come here?" "I did." "What do you make of Thomas?" Charlotte set her cup down. "I make him to be honest, hard-working, private, not much given to impressing people." "That's accurate." Vera studied her. "Do you find it strange that a man with so little talks so rarely about wanting more?" The question was too precisely aimed to be casual. Charlotte looked at her steadily. "I find it unusual, but I find it more attractive than the alternative." Something shifted in Vera's expression, a reassessment swift and quiet. "Most women would have been on the next stagecoach east within a week," Vera said. "I'm not most women. No." Vera smiled, and for the first time it was genuinely warm. "I don't think you are." After Vera left, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window and turned the conversation over in her mind. A man with so little who talks so rarely about wanting more. It had the texture of a sentence with something underneath it, like a floor that sounded hollow when you walked across it. She had been answering Thomas's letters for 4 months. She had thought she knew the shape of him. But Vera Calloway had just reminded her that there were people in this valley who had known Thomas Reed for years, and they spoke of him in a register she couldn't quite locate, not pity, not dismissal. Something closer to deference. It was Pete who first cracked the surface, though he didn't mean to. They were working in the barn one afternoon. Pete patching a split in a fence rail. Charlotte oiling a set of harnesses that had been left too long without attention when one of the neighboring ranch hands rode up. His name was Cal Briggs, young and loud, in the way of men who haven't yet been embarrassed enough times to learn better. He leaned off his horse and called out to Pete. Heard Reed's Denver contact came through. That the woman... Pete glanced at Charlotte. Get on, Cal. What Denver contact? Charlotte asked. Cal blinked, appearing to register for the first time that she was actually standing there. Just business talk, ma'am. Didn't mean to intrude. He turned his horse and left at a speed that suggested he knew he'd said something he shouldn't. Pete, Charlotte said. Let it go, Miss Bennett. I'm Mrs. Reed, she said quietly. Or I will be. And I'd like to know what Denver contact Cal Briggs thought I'd already know about. Pete was quiet for a long moment. He set down his tools. Thomas does some business, he said carefully. With people in Denver, legal matters, land purchases, that sort of thing. He paused. He handles other people's situations sometimes, when the situations need handling. What kind of situations? The kind where someone bigger is trying to take what belongs to someone smaller. He picked up his tools again. That's all I know, Miss Bennett. And if you want to know more, you'll need to ask the man himself. Charlotte asked Thomas at supper. He put down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression he wore when he was deciding how much of himself to give. I help people with land disputes sometimes, he said, when I can. How? I know people. I know how these situations work. He picked up his fork again. It doesn't cost much, and it matters a great deal to the families involved. Do you take anything for it? No. Thomas. She kept her voice level. Why? He looked at her across the table. Because someone should, he said simply. She wanted to push further. She could feel the edges of something larger just beneath that answer. But something in his face told her the door had opened as far as it was going to open tonight. She let it go. But she was listening more carefully now. The following week, a man came to the ranch who didn't belong there. She knew it immediately, the way she'd known in Boston when someone entered a room with intentions that didn't match their expression. He arrived in mid-afternoon on a horse that was too well-bred for a working rancher, wearing a coat that was too clean for a man who worked outdoors. He asked Pete whether Thomas was available in the tone of a man who expected the answer to be yes. Thomas appeared from the barn. The two men spoke in the yard for nearly 20 minutes. Charlotte watched from the kitchen window without pretending she wasn't watching. When the man rode away, Thomas came inside and sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long moment. He poured himself coffee. He stared at the cup. Who was that? Charlotte asked. A man named Caldwell, Richard Caldwell. Thomas wrapped both hands around the cup. He owns a lot of land north of here. He wants to own more. Does he want yours? Thomas was quiet. Thomas. He's been trying to acquire land in this valley for 3 years, Thomas said. He buys from families who are struggling at prices well below value. Sometimes they're willing to sell, sometimes they're made willing. He set the cup down. He came today to tell me he's interested in this property. Are you interested in selling? No. Then it's simple, she said. He looked at her for a moment. It's not simple, Charlotte. Men like Caldwell have attorneys. They have the ear of people in the territorial government. They have documents that say what they want them to say. He paused. They don't hear no the first time. Something about the way he said it, the steadiness of it, the absence of any trace of self-pity or alarm, struck her with unexpected force. This was a man who had already thought through what was coming. He was not surprised by it. He was not afraid of it. He was just telling her the truth the way he always told her the truth. All right, she said, Then we'll deal with it when it comes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to, Thomas." She looked back at him calmly. "If you say I don't have to, I will remind you of the conversation we had about plates. This is my home now. That matters to me." A pause. "Does it matter to you?" His jaw worked for a moment. "Yes," he said. It was the most direct thing he had said to her yet. She held it carefully, the way she'd held the memory of the wildflowers in the jar on the first night. She was beginning to understand that with Thomas Reed, you measured things differently. A single word said plainly, and meant entirely, was worth more than a paragraph of beautiful language that didn't cost anything. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "Tell me everything you know about Richard Caldwell," she said. He told her, and she listened to every word because she was beginning to suspect that the man across the table from her was carrying a great deal more than a struggling ranch on his shoulders, and that the time for her to understand exactly how much was running out faster than either of them knew. That night, Thomas spread 3 documents across the kitchen table and explained them to her with the precision of a man who had studied the problem long enough to know exactly where it was weakest. The first was a map, hand-drawn detailed, showing the boundaries of every ranch in the San Luis Valley. Thomas's land sat at the center of it, like the last piece of something Caldwell was trying to complete. 3 properties to the north and 2 to the east had already changed hands in the past 2 years. Thomas had drawn small marks beside each one with dates. "He moves in sequence," Thomas said. He traced the pattern with one finger. "He never goes after the strongest property first. He takes the smaller ones around. It isolates the one he really wants, then comes in when there's nobody left to push back." Charlotte leaned over the table. "And you're the one he really wants. My land controls the water access for this whole section of the valley. The creek that runs through my eastern pasture feeds every property south of the ridge. Without it, most of this land is worth a fraction of what it sells for now." He folded the map. "Caldwell knows that. He's known it for 3 years. He's been patient. Why hasn't he moved against you directly before now?" Thomas was quiet for a beat too long. "Because something has been stopping him," she answered for herself. "What?" He looked at her across the table. "Me," he said. She waited. "I've helped some of the families he targeted, before they got into a position where they had no choice but to sell. I've intervened in some of the legal matters, quietly." He paused. "He knows it. He's never been able to prove it, but he knows." Charlotte sat back in her chair and looked at him. This man in his patched elbows and worn boots who had told her he had nothing but his land and his word, sitting at a kitchen table, mapping the strategic moves of a land-grabbing operation, as though he had been watching it from the beginning. "How long have you been watching him?" she asked. 3 years. "And in 3 years you've managed to slow him down, alone." "Mostly, Thomas." She said his name carefully, the way you say the name of a thing you're only just beginning to understand the size of. "What exactly are you?" He met her eyes. Something moved behind his, a flicker of decision, or maybe of exhaustion. "A man who's trying to keep what's his," he said, "and help other people keep what's theirs." It was not a lie. She could tell that much. But it was not the whole truth either, and she was starting to understand that with Thomas Reed, the whole truth had layers to it that he had spent years learning to keep covered. She let it rest for the night. But she did not forget it. She was as Thomas was beginning to discover a woman who did not forget much. In the days that followed, she watched him differently. Not suspiciously, she had no reason for suspicion. But attentively, the way she'd been trained by years of managing a household on a thinning budget to notice the details that revealed the actual truth of a situation rather than its surface appearance. What she noticed first was the visitors. They came infrequently and without announcement, usually in the late afternoon when the ranch work was winding down. Never more than 2 at a time. Never from the direction of Harlow Crossing. Always from the back roads, the far approaches, the routes that didn't pass through town. They spoke with Thomas in the yard or in the barn, never in the house, and they never stayed for supper, and Thomas never introduced them or explained their presence afterward. Pete behaved as though the visitors were part of the ordinary furniture of life on the ranch. He'd nod at them, sometimes exchange a word, and then carry on with whatever he was doing with the practiced unconcern of a man who had made a deliberate choice not to know more than he needed to know. Charlotte made a different choice. After the third such visit, she walked out to the yard where Thomas was watching a departing rider and stood beside him. "That's the second man from the Hargreave family land this week," she said. Thomas turned to look at her. "The older one came Tuesday," she continued. "The younger one today. The Hargreave property is one of the ones marked on your map with a date, October last year." She kept her voice level. "What's happening to them?" He studied her for a moment. Then he seemed to make a decision. "Caldwell is pushing them," he said. "He got a man appointed to the county assessor's office 6 months ago. Since then, 3 properties have been reassessed at values that trigger back tax obligations the families can't meet. If they can't pay, the county seizes. Caldwell buys from the county at auction for almost nothing." Charlotte felt a cold clarity settle over her. That's fraud. It's legal fraud, which is the worst kind because it's very hard to fight. But you're trying. I'm trying to find the documentation that proves the assessments were manipulated. If I can show that the assessor changed the records after the fact. He stopped. "It's taking time I may not have." She was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "What kind of records?" she asked. "Assessment ledgers, filed copies against original survey records. If the numbers were changed, there'll be a discrepancy between what the assessor's office has on file and what the original surveyors recorded." He paused. "But the assessor's office is in Pueblo, and the county clerk who would have the original surveys is not cooperative." Charlotte looked at the road where the Hargreave rider had disappeared. Then she looked at Thomas. "I know how to read land records," she said. "My father was a property attorney for 11 years before he lost the practice. I grew up watching him prepare case files." She paused. "I'm not an attorney, but I know what manipulated records look like, and I know how to find a discrepancy." Thomas looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not surprise exactly. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. It was more like the particular attention of someone who has just been handed a tool they didn't know existed. "I'd need to go to Pueblo," she said. "That's a 2-day ride." "I'm aware." He was silent. She could see him working through it, the logistics, the risk, the question of whether he trusted her enough to let her carry something this important. "I'll go with you," he said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to." She recognized the echo. She allowed herself the smallest smile. "All right," she said. "We'll go." They left 2 mornings later before dawn, with Pete holding things at the ranch and a letter of introduction. Thomas had obtained from a contact she didn't know he had addressed to a records clerk in Pueblo named Amos Finch. The letter said Thomas Reed was a property owner with a legitimate dispute inquiry, which was true in the most direct sense and sidelong in every other. The ride to Pueblo was 2 days of cold air and long silences, and unexpectedly, almost alarmingly, conversation. It happened on the afternoon of the first day. They had stopped to rest the horses near a shallow creek, and Charlotte was sitting on a flat rock eating the biscuits she'd packed, and Thomas was watering the horses, and the silence between them had the quality it sometimes got now, not empty, but full of something neither of them had yet named. He sat down on a rock 6 feet from her and said without preamble, "My mother died when I was 9. She looked up. "My grandfather raised me after that," he continued. He was looking at the creek. He was a hard man. Not cruel, but he believed in work the way some people believe in religion as the only honest answer to the question of what a person is. He was quiet for a moment. "He taught me everything I know about land, about water rights, about what makes a piece of ground worth fighting for." She said nothing. She understood instinctively that this was not a moment for response. It was a moment for being present. "He died when I was 22, Thomas said. "He left me the ranch. What I have now, it's what's left of what he built." He paused. "It's not much, but it's his, and I won't give it to a man like Caldwell." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming in low, and he had turned his face toward it without seeming to notice, and she thought not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that whatever she had expected when she agreed to come west, it had not been this. It had not been a man who read agricultural reports and kept his ledgers in perfect order, and picked wildflowers for a woman's windowsill, and fought quietly and alone for other people's land because someone should. "Tell me about him," she said. "Your grandfather." Thomas turned to look at her. A pause, that measuring look. He had the one she'd first found unreadable, and now knew to be him, deciding how much he trusted. Then he told her. He talked for 2 hours. She had never heard him talk that long about anything. He told her about Elias Reed, who had come to Colorado from Tennessee with nothing but a mule and a surveying kit, and the absolute conviction that land was the only thing that lasted. Who had built the ranch from a single claim to 300 acres through 30 years of work and weather, and one drought that had nearly killed everything. Who had known every neighboring rancher by name, first and last, and the names of their children, and the year they'd each homesteaded. Who had kept a record book not for accounting, but for memory. Every name, every date, every agreement made on a handshake. "That record book," Charlotte said. "Do you still have it?" Thomas looked at her. "Yes." "Is it current? Are you still adding to it?" A long pause. "Yes," he said, and something in his voice had changed a quality she couldn't immediately place. Then she placed it. Surprise. Genuine surprise. "Why does that surprise you?" she asked. "Nobody's ever asked that before." He looked at the creek again. Nobody ever cared enough about that part to ask. Charlotte set down her biscuit. She looked at this man, this complicated, layered, quietly extraordinary man she had married for want of better options, who had told her he had nothing impressive to offer, who had apparently spent years believing that. "Thomas," she said, "what exactly do you think you are?" He frowned. What you just described your grandfather, that record book, the way you've been quietly defending people in this valley for years. That's not a poor cowboy trying to hold on to a struggling ranch." She kept her voice even, but she felt something building behind her ribs, something that was partly anger and partly something she didn't have a name for yet. "That's a man of considerable substance, and you've been walking around like you have something to apologize for." He stared at her. "I told you in my first letter," he said. "I don't have money, You have integrity," she said. "You have loyalty. You have a legacy and a record book and a network of people who trust you enough to ride to your ranch in the dark." She paused. "Do you know how rare that is? Do you have any idea what kind of man that makes you?" He was very still. "Your letters," he said finally slowly. You said you weren't looking for wealth." "I wasn't. I believed you." "You should have," she said. "You should still." He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked away, and she saw him swallow a single quiet movement, like a man absorbing something he hadn't expected to receive. They didn't speak again for a while. But when they remounted and continued toward Pueblo, he rode closer beside her than he had before. She noticed. She said nothing about it. But she noticed. The county records office in Pueblo was housed in a building that smelled of old paper and coal smoke, staffed by a clerk named Amos Finch, who read Thomas's letter of introduction, looked at Charlotte, looked at Thomas and said, "You've got 2 hours. Don't remove anything." He was small, precise, and clearly afraid of something, though Charlotte could not immediately determine whether it was them or someone else. They worked in silence at a long table. Charlotte moving through the assessment ledgers with the methodical focus her father had spent years drilling into her. She had watched him prepare cases from the time she was 12. She knew what legitimate records looked like, the consistency of handwriting, the sequential logic of entry, dates the way errors were corrected with a line and an initial not erased and rewritten. She knew what records looked like when someone had gone back into them. It took 40 minutes to find the first discrepancy. It took another 20 to find 3 more. The entries for the Hargreave property, originally assessed at a value consistent with comparable land in the area, had been altered. The original figures were still faintly visible beneath the new ones. Whoever had made the changes had used a different pressure on the pen, and the ghost of the earlier numbers showed through in the right light. Charlotte pointed it out to Thomas without speaking. She simply placed her finger on the page. He leaned in, looked, then looked at her. She nodded once. He pulled out a small notebook and began copying the discrepant figures, the original versus the altered, the dates, the ledger page numbers. Charlotte kept moving through the records, noting 3 additional properties with the same ghost number problem, the same inconsistent pen pressure, the same tell. By the time Amos Finch came back to signal their 2 hours were up, she had a complete picture. In the hallway outside, Thomas stood holding the notebook and looked at what she'd written. "This is enough," he said. "To file a challenge to the assessments, yes. Possibly enough to trigger an inquiry if you get it to the right person in Denver." She paused. "Do you know anyone in Denver?" He was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet again, the one with layers. "Yes," he said. "Someone who can actually move this forward. Not just listen to it." He met her eyes. "Yes, Charlotte. Someone who can move it forward." She studied him. "Who?" "A man named Harlan Voss. He's an attorney. He handles significant property cases in the territory." "How do you know him?" Thomas's jaw moved briefly. "We've worked together before." She waited. "On similar matters," he said. She understood in that moment that this was another layer she was not yet going to reach. She filed it carefully in the same place she'd filed the information about his grandfather and the record book, and the way Pete had said he handles other people's situations, sometimes as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a supposedly struggling ranch hand to do. "All right," she said. "Then we write to Harlan Voss. Tonight from the inn. I'll help you draft it. You need the technical language of the discrepancy to be precise, or it won't carry weight." She started toward the door. "Charlotte." She turned. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she hadn't been able to name the first time she'd seen it, and could now identify as the look of a man who was being seen more clearly than he was accustomed to. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words. From Thomas Reed. It was a great deal more than that. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when Caldwell loses." She pushed through the door into the cold Pueblo air. She did not hear him behind her for a moment, and then she did his boots on the wooden boards, his stride falling into step beside her. And something about that, the simple fact of it, made her feel less like a woman who had arrived in a strange place, and more like someone who lived somewhere. It was a feeling she had not expected. She wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but she held on to it all the way back to the inn, and at supper across a small table with food. Neither of them tasted much of because they were working on the letter to Harlan Voss, and it needed to be right. They worked until the lamp oil was almost gone. Thomas wrote, she corrected, he rewrote, she refined. By the end, they had 4 pages of clear, precise documentation, the discrepancies named and dated. The affected properties listed, the pattern of the assessor's manipulations, laid out in language that could not be misunderstood. Thomas set down the pen and read it through one last time. "This is the best constructed argument I've ever put my name to," he said. "Your name and mine," she said. "I'm signing it too." He looked up. "Charlotte. My name carries the same weight as yours here. Possibly more. A woman from Boston with no stake in your politics and no history in this valley is harder to dismiss as a personal vendetta." She met his eyes. "Let me help properly." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he slid the paper across the table. She signed her name beneath his. Thomas Reed. Charlotte Reed. It was the first time she had signed that name. She looked at it for a moment, the way the 2 names sat together on the page, the way they looked like they belonged there, like a thing that made sense. She pushed the paper back before he could see her looking at it too long. They rode back to the ranch the following morning, arriving in the late afternoon, to find Pete waiting in the yard, with an expression that meant something had happened. "Man came by," Pete said. "Yesterday evening. Left a letter." He held it out to Thomas. Thomas opened it. Read it. His face did not change. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "Who's it from?" Charlotte asked. Thomas looked at her. "Caldwell." The silence had a new weight to it now. "What does he want?" she asked. "He's made a formal offer to purchase the ranch," Thomas said. "He's given me 2 weeks to respond." He paused. He also mentions that he has documentation suggesting certain irregularities in the original land grant of this property. Charlotte felt something cold and sharp move through her. What kind of irregularities? Unspecified. Thomas's voice was entirely even. That's intentional. Vague enough to be threatening. Specific enough to suggest he has something real. Does he? Thomas looked at her for a long moment. I don't know, he said. And that's the problem. The three of them stood in the yard in the fading light. Pete with his hat in his hands. Thomas with Caldwell's letter folded in his pocket. Charlotte with 4 pages of evidence against Caldwell's fraud in her saddlebag. And the sudden clear understanding that the man they were fighting was not operating the way she'd thought. He wasn't being careful because he was afraid of Thomas Reed. He was being careful because he was ready. He had been ready for a long time. And whatever he had on Thomas, whatever document or record or piece of history he was holding quietly in reserve, it was something Thomas himself was not entirely certain about. That uncertainty in a man as measured and precise as Thomas Reed told her more than anything Caldwell had written. Go inside, Thomas said. I'll put the horses up. Charlotte didn't move. Tell me what he might have. Thomas looked at her. Pete looked at the ground. Thomas, she said. Not a demand, not a plea, just his name spoken in the tone she had arrived at over the past weeks. The tone that said, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and you can tell me or not tell me, but I'd rather you did. He looked at her for a long moment. There was a land transfer, he said slowly, 15 years ago, between my grandfather and a man named Harlow Briggs. It was complicated. Elias handled it himself without an attorney, and the documentation was never filed correctly with the county. He paused. If someone went looking for irregularities in the original grant, that's what they'd find. Is the transfer legitimate? Yes, completely. Then it can be documented after the fact. He hesitated. It would take finding the people involved. Some of them may not be alive. Harlow Briggs's family would need to... He stopped. Charlotte picked up her saddlebag. Then we'd better start, she said. She walked into the house. Pete looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the house, at the light in the kitchen window, at the shadow moving behind the glass, as Charlotte set her bag on the table and began to work. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the fence post, and something moved across his face that was too private and too complicated and too new for a man like him to show in front of another person, even Pete, who had known him for 11 years. He straightened up. He turned toward the barn. Get the horses in, he said. Already on it, said Pete. Thomas walked into the barn alone, and in the quiet and the dark of it, with the horses moving around him, and the smell of hay and cold air. He stood for a moment and breathed. He had told her the truth, all of it that he'd shown her tonight. And she hadn't flinched. She hadn't pulled back. She had picked up her bag and walked into the house and started working. He had spent years waiting for someone to walk in the other direction. The weight of that, what it meant, what it cost him to admit it, even to himself, pressed against his ribs in the dark. He picked up a brush and started on the first horse. He had work to do. So did she. And for the first time in a very long time, Thomas Reed was not entirely sure he was carrying everything alone. The letter to Harlan Voss went out on a Tuesday. Charlotte mailed it herself, riding into Harlow Crossing alone for the first time, tying her horse outside the postal office and handing the envelope to the clerk with the calm certainty of a woman who had decided something and was no longer debating it. The clerk looked at the name on the envelope. Then he looked at her. You're Thomas Reed's wife, he said. I am. He took the letter without further comment. But she saw him look at it again as she turned to leave, and the way he looked at it, the particular quality of his attention, told her that Harlan Voss was not an unknown name in this part of Colorado. She filed that away. Riding back, she passed Vera Calloway's gate and saw Vera standing at the fence. Vera raised a hand. Charlotte slowed. You look like a woman who's just done something important, Vera said. I mailed a letter. Vera's eyes were sharp and warm at the same time, a combination Charlotte had come to respect. Does Thomas know? It was his letter. I mean, does he know you mailed it yourself, alone? Charlotte considered that. Probably not yet. Vera smiled. Good. she said with a satisfaction that seemed to reach back further than the present moment. He needs to learn what he's got. Charlotte rode on. The remark settled in her like something warm, and she let it, and told herself it didn't mean what it felt like it meant, and mostly didn't believe herself. Back at the ranch, she found Thomas in the kitchen, going through his grandfather's record book. He had it open on the table, a heavy ledger with cracked leather corners and pages so closely written they nearly looked printed. He was moving through it with controlled urgency, page by page making notes on a separate sheet. He looked up when she came in. "Harlow Briggs," she said, pulling off her gloves. "You told me his family would need to confirm the land transfer. Where are they?" "His son runs a hardware business in Del Norte, about 40 miles west." "Has he been contacted?" "Not yet." She sat down across from him. "Why not?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Because I needed to find the original documentation first, to know exactly what Martin Briggs would be confirming." He turned the ledger and pointed to an entry. She leaned forward to read it. The handwriting was older, more formal, the ink browned with time. "A record of transaction between Elias Reed and Harlow Briggs, dated June of 1871, land boundaries consideration paid terms of transfer." "That's in the record book," she said, "but not in the county files." "Elias filed a deed of transfer with the territorial office in Denver," Thomas said, "but the county records from that period are incomplete. There was a courthouse fire in 1874. Many of the land records from before the fire were lost or damaged." He paused. "Caldwell's man found the gap. The county has no copy of the Briggs transfer. Without it, if someone challenges the original grant boundaries, this section." He put his finger on the map. "This whole eastern pasture, including the creek access, could be claimed as inadequately documented." Charlotte looked at the map, then at the ledger, then at him. "The Denver filing," she said. "Is it still there?" "It should be, but accessing it requires a formal records request to the Territorial Land Office, which takes time I don't have. Unless someone already has standing access." She watched his face. "Does Harlan Voss?" A pause that was half a breath too long. "Yes," Thomas said. "Then your letter to him wasn't just about the assessment fraud." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She could see it, the architecture of what he'd been building, the way the letter to Voss and the Pueblo records and the Briggs family confirmation were all pieces of the same structure, and he had been constructing it alone for God only knew how long before she arrived and started handing him tools. "How much have you already told Voss?" she asked. "Everything I had before Pueblo." He looked at her directly. "Your work in the records office is new. He doesn't have that yet." "The letter I mailed has it." Something moved in his expression, a beat of recalibration, quick and quiet. "You added it." "I copied my notes into an addendum before I sealed it." She kept her voice even. "I thought it was relevant." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "It is relevant. It's the strongest piece we have." "I know," she said. "That's why I included it." He looked at her across the table with an expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that meant she had done something he hadn't anticipated, and he was deciding how to relate to a world in which that kept happening. It was not an unpleasant expression to receive. "You're not going to apologize for it," he said. "No." "All right, Thomas." She folded her hands on the table. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me all of it. Not the careful version. All of it." She held his gaze. "What exactly is Harlan Voss?" Thomas set down his pencil. He looked at the record book, at the map, at his hands, then at her. "He is an attorney," he said. "He handles property law in the Colorado Territory, primarily in Denver. He's worked on significant land cases, including several that involve challenging corrupt assessments and fraudulent acquisition schemes." He paused. "He and I have worked together on 3 cases in the past 5 years, helping families who were being pushed off their land, identifying the legal mechanisms being used against them, building cases." Another pause longer. "We've won 2 of the 3. Charlotte absorbed this. "And the 3rd, she said. "The family couldn't wait for the legal process. They sold before the case was complete." His jaw tightened just slightly. Caldwell bought that property too, 2 years ago. She understood now why Caldwell felt personal. She understood now what 3 years of watching actually looked like from the inside. 3 years of building cases of winning some and losing others. Of seeing families leave land their grandparents had broken their hands to claim, while a man in a clean coat bought it for fractions of its value and filed the paperwork with a smile. "You've been fighting him for 3 years, she said. Through legal channels, quietly, without anyone in this valley knowing the full scope of it." "Yes." "Why quietly?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because if Caldwell knew the extent of what I was doing, he would have moved against me directly. Much sooner. And I wouldn't have had time to build what I needed to fight back." He paused. The anonymity was the protection. "Was," she said. "He came to you directly. He's made the offer." "Yes." "Which means he thinks he's ready." "Yes." The word sat between them with its full weight. Charlotte looked at the map on the table. At the properties marked with dates, the ones already lost, the ones still standing. At Thomas's land in the center of it, with the creek running through the eastern pasture like a vein that fed everything. "We have to move faster than he expects," she said. "Yes." The Briggs confirmation first, then the Denver records, then whatever Voss can do with the Pueblo documentation. She was thinking aloud now, ordering it the way her father had taught her to order a case, by urgency and dependency, by what you needed before you could use what you had. 2 weeks is not enough time to do all of it. "I know. So we need to buy time." He looked at her. "How?" "You respond to Caldwell's offer," she said. "Not with a refusal, with a counter-question. You express conditional interest. You say you need to review certain documentation regarding the property boundaries before you can respond in good faith. You buy yourself 3 more weeks without lying and without showing your hand." Thomas stared at her. "If you refuse outright," she said, "he escalates immediately. If you appear to consider, he waits. He doesn't want a legal fight any more than you do, he wants a quiet purchase. Give him the appearance of possibility, and he'll hold." "That's—" He stopped. "What?" "That's exactly what Voss would say to do." "Your attorney and I apparently think alike." She stood up. "Write the response to Caldwell tonight. I'll help you word it. Tomorrow morning we ride to Del Norte." He blinked. "Both of us." Martin Briggs is more likely to cooperate with a woman present. Men who run hardware businesses in small towns are accustomed to women asking careful questions about records and documentation. It's less threatening than you arriving alone and asking about his father's land dealings. She picked up her gloves. "Also, I want to see his face when he talks about it. I'll know if he's telling us everything." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather's record book," he said slowly. "You want to bring it?" "Absolutely. It's the most credible corroboration of the original transfer. Elias's handwriting dated in sequence with the surrounding entries, it establishes a continuous record that predates any dispute." She paused at the kitchen doorway. "And Thomas, bring the surveying kit your grandfather used. If Harlow Briggs confirmed the boundaries in person, with Elias Martin, we'll know that. Physical tools create a different kind of recognition than paper." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you learn to think like this?" She looked back at him from the doorway. "From a man who was very good at his work until he wasn't, and who made sure I understood the difference." A pause. "My father was a good attorney, Thomas. He just wasn't a careful one. I learned both lessons." She went upstairs. Thomas sat at the kitchen table for a long moment after she left. Then he opened a fresh page in his notebook and began drafting the response to Caldwell. He wrote more carefully than he had ever written anything. The ride to Del Norte took most of the next day. They left before sunrise, and the cold was the kind that got into your bones in the first hour and stayed there, and Charlotte rode without complaint and without conversation for the first 2 hours, which Thomas had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but concentration. She was thinking, ordering, preparing. He recognized it because he did the same thing. He found he had stopped noticing the strangeness of knowing that about her. It had simply become the way the creek's path through the eastern pasture was true. Something he knew without having to relearn it every morning. Martin Briggs was a compact, careful man in his middle 50s who ran a hardware store that was organized with the same precision as his father's reputation. Everything in its place. Everything labeled, every account in order. He looked at Thomas Reed, and his expression held the guarded quality of a man who knew something was coming and wasn't certain whether it was good or bad. Then he looked at Charlotte. "Mrs. Reed," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing us." Something in Martin's posture adjusted, not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. They sat in his back office, and Charlotte let Thomas begin, which surprised Martin visibly. Most women, his expression said, would have deferred entirely. But when Thomas had laid out the core situation, it was Charlotte who said, "Mr. Briggs, we are not here to dispute your father's transaction with Elias Reed. We are here because someone else may attempt to dispute it, and we need to ensure that when that happens, you have everything you need to confirm what actually occurred." Martin looked at her steadily. "What kind of someone?" "A man named Richard Caldwell," Thomas said. The name did something to Martin Briggs's face. Not fear, something older and harder than fear. Recognition and anger. "Caldwell," he said. "You know him," Charlotte said. "My cousin's family lost their property to that man 2 years ago." Martin's voice was flat. "Reassessment fraud. They couldn't fight it." He looked at Thomas. "Is he coming after you?" "He's trying." Martin Briggs sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Thomas with an expression that had entirely lost its guardedness. "Tell me what you need," he said. What they needed took 3 hours to gather. Martin produced his father's personal records, a shoebox of papers carefully preserved, including a signed receipt of transaction from Harlow Briggs to Elias Reed, witnessed by 2 men whose names Thomas recognized from adjacent properties in the valley. He produced a hand-drawn boundary map in Harlow's handwriting. He produced a letter from Harlow written to Martin years later, referencing the sale and the terms. Each document was dated, signed, and corroborated by at least one other piece in the set. Charlotte worked through them methodically, noting the corroboration points, the witness names, the dates. She organized them in the order they'd need to be presented, not by date, but by evidentiary weight, the strongest anchors at the foundation. When they were done, Martin Briggs looked at the organized stack on his desk and said to Thomas, "Where'd you find her?" Thomas looked at Charlotte. "Boston," he said. Martin shook his head slowly. "You got lucky, Reed." Thomas said nothing. But Charlotte, gathering papers and not looking up, felt something move in the quality of the silence he left behind. Something that was not disagreement. They rode harder on the return trip, arriving at the ranch in full dark, to find Pete waiting at the barn with a lamp and an expression that told them something had happened. "Ryder came from town," Pete said. "About 2 hours ago." "Who?" Thomas said. "Didn't give a name. Left a package for you." Pete held out a flat envelope sealed with wax. Said it was urgent and from Denver. Thomas took it. Opened it, standing there in the barn by lamplight. Charlotte watched his face. His expression went absolutely still. "What is it?" she said. He handed it to her. It was a letter from Harlan Voss. 2 pages dense with legal precision, and she read it in 30 seconds and then read the last paragraph again. Harlan Voss had received Thomas's letter, including her addendum, 2 days ago. He had already filed a preliminary challenge to the assessor's appointment on grounds of procedural irregularity. He had requested a copy of the original assessment records from the county on behalf of 3 affected property owners. And this was the part she read twice. He had submitted a request to the Territorial Governor's Office for an emergency audit of land assessments in the San Luis Valley, citing documented evidence of systemic manipulation. "He moved fast," she said. "He always does when he has enough to move with." Thomas took the letter back. He stared at it. "The governor's office audit, if that's granted, it's out of Caldwell's hands. He can't suppress an audit authorized by the governor." "How long to get authorization?" "Voss says 2 to 3 weeks, maybe less if the evidence is as clear as my letter described." She looked at him. "Which gives us exactly the window Caldwell's offer creates if you respond tonight." He looked at her. "Write it with me," he said. They wrote Caldwell's response at the kitchen table by lamplight, with Martin Briggs's documents spread beside them, and Harlan Voss's letter propped against the lamp. Thomas drafted Charlotte refined, and what they produced was a masterpiece of careful language. Polite measured expressing Thomas's need to review the property documentation before responding definitively, requesting a 30-day extension for due diligence, citing his desire to enter any transaction in complete good faith. It would read to Caldwell like a man considering his options. It was actually a man buying 3 weeks while a governor's audit gathered momentum and a Denver attorney filed challenges that would make any fraudulent acquisition legally untenable. Charlotte sealed it herself. "Mail it first thing tomorrow," Thomas said. "I will." He looked at the documents on the table, the Briggs papers, the Voss letter, the copy of the Pueblo discrepancies. 4 weeks ago, none of this existed in the same place. 4 weeks ago, he had been fighting alone the way he had always fought alone with the competence of a man who had made a private faith of self-sufficiency. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up from sealing the envelope. "I need to tell you something." Something in his tone made her set the envelope down. He looked at her across the table. And for the first time since she had arrived at this ranch, Thomas Reed looked like a man who was about to say something he had been carrying a long time, and was setting down carefully the way you set down something that has become too heavy and too necessary at the same time. "The ranch is not what I told you," he said. She was very still. "I told you I had a working ranch and very little else." He kept his eyes on her. "That's true. But it's not complete." He paused. "My grandfather's original land holding before he split it up to help families settle during the drought years was substantially larger than what I have now. Those parcels were transferred to neighboring families, but in several cases the transfers were structured to allow buyback if the families ever needed to leave." He paused again. 7 of those parcels have come without improving them, without working them visibly because—" He stopped. "Because if anyone knew the extent of the holding," Charlotte said quietly, "Caldwell would have moved on you 3 years ago instead of working around you." He held her gaze. "Yes." "So the struggling ranch," she said. "The worn boots, the patched elbows. All real," he said immediately. "I don't pretend poverty for performance. I live the same way I've always lived. I don't need more than what I use." He paused. "But the truth is that I own considerably more land than I've let anyone see. And the land I own controls not just the creek access, it controls the entire water distribution for the Southern Valley." He held her gaze steadily, because she deserved that. "If Caldwell acquires my visible holdings through fraud and then investigates what's attached, he would effectively control the water rights for every ranch in this part of the territory." The magnitude of it arrived slowly the way large things do. Charlotte sat with it for a long moment. She was not angry. She examined herself for anger and found something more complicated, the particular sensation of a picture becoming larger than its frame, of realizing that what you thought you were looking at was only a portion of something much bigger, and that you had been right about the important things while being significantly wrong about the scale. "You needed to know if someone would choose you without knowing the scale," she said. "Yes." His voice was quiet and direct. "I've watched men with money attract women who wanted the money. And I've watched women choose men for security and spend the rest of their lives wanting something that was never in the transaction." He paused. "I didn't want that. I wanted someone who would—" He stopped, started again. "I needed to know you were here because of something real." "You've been testing me," she said. "No." The answer was immediate and firm. "I haven't been testing you. I've been waiting to know if I could trust what I felt was true." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the table. Howe was right. There was a difference. Testing implied a trap, a standard to be met or failed. What he was describing was something more like fear. The specific fear of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that what people showed you and what they wanted were rarely the same thing, and who had built a life on the premise that the only way to know someone truly was to let them know you before they knew what knowing you was worth. She understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to admit, because she had done her own version of it. She had come west because she needed a real life and a real person, not because she'd had nothing to lose. She had left Boston knowing Gerald was right, that it was a risk, and gone anyway, because she had read Thomas Reed's letters and recognized something in them she had never found in Howard Pratt's dining room or in any of the safe, suffocating lives that had been offered to her. She had come because she thought he was real. He was real. He was just larger than she'd known. "How much land?" she said. He told her. The number was not obscene. It was not the kind of wealth that made men into different creatures. But it was significant. Several thousand acres of carefully held, strategically located land, managed with the quiet intelligence of someone who had understood from childhood that land was not wealth the way money was wealth. Land was different. Land lasted. Land was a kind of responsibility. She looked at him. "What were you going to tell me if none of this had happened, if Caldwell hadn't come, if there was no fight? When were you going to tell me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "When I was sure," he said. "Sure of what?" "Sure that you wouldn't look at it differently than you look at me." The words landed with the simple weight of truth. Charlotte held them for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what the difference is between you and Howard Pratt?" He waited. "Howard Pratt told me everything he had in the first 10 minutes. Every number, every property, every connection." She kept her voice even. "Because what he had was all he was. He needed me to see it immediately, because without it, there was nothing else to see." She paused. "You told me what you were. You made me work to understand the size of it. And when I did, when I actually looked, I found that it was bigger than I thought, and not one bit of it changed what I already knew about you." She held his gaze. "That's the difference." Thomas Reed, who was not a man given to visible emotion, who had weathered drought and legal fraud and 3 years of fighting alone, and apparently the entirety of his adult life, with his feelings kept in good order below the surface. Thomas Reed looked at her across the kitchen table, and for just a moment his face held something unguarded. It was brief. He recovered it quickly. But she had seen it. She picked up the sealed envelope. "I'm mailing this tomorrow," she said. "And then I think you should write to Martin Briggs and tell him what you told me tonight, all of it. Because if he's going to stand up as a witness when this goes to inquiry, he deserves to know what he's standing up for." Thomas nodded. "And Thomas." She stopped at the doorway. "From now on, no more careful versions." He held her gaze. "No more careful versions," he said. She went upstairs. She lay awake in the small room with the east-facing window, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the horses moving in the barn, the wind off the ridge, the particular silence of land that had been lived on and worked and loved for a long time. She thought about Elias Reed, who had kept a record book because he believed in memory. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had continued that record book because he believed in everything it meant, and who had spent 11 years quietly protecting a valley that had no idea it was being protected. She thought about herself, Charlotte Bennett from Boston, who had stepped onto a train to escape a life that was too small and ended up in the middle of something enormous. She had not come west to be saved. She had not come west to save anyone. She had come because one man's letters had told her the truth, and the truth had been as rarer than gold in this world. She was somewhere between sleep and waking when she heard it. A sound from outside. Not the horses. Not the wind. A deliberate sound. The creak of the yard gate, followed by footsteps that were trying not to be footsteps. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake. In the dark of the yard below, 2 figures, moving toward the barn. She had her boots on and was at Thomas's door in 15 seconds. She knocked once hard. He opened it before the second knock. He was dressed. His face told her he'd heard it too. "Barn," she said. "I know." He moved past her. "Stay inside. Thomas." "Charlotte." He turned back just long enough to look at her, that direct, steady look. "I know you won't, but please stay back from the door." He went downstairs. She followed. What happened in the next 20 minutes would change everything they thought they understood about how far Richard Caldwell was willing to go and how little time they actually had left. Thomas reached the barn first. Charlotte was 6 steps behind him, and she stayed there not because he'd told her to, but because she understood instinctively that in the dark, 2 people moving at different speeds created confusion, and confusion was the enemy. He pushed through the barn door. The two figures inside spun around. One of them dropped what he was holding, a glass bottle stoppered with a rag. It hit the ground and didn't break, and Charlotte saw it clearly in the lantern light Pete had left burning low on the post oil. The rag was singed at the tip. They had not lit it yet. Thomas stood between them and the door, and his voice when he spoke was so quiet it was almost gentle. "You want to put that on the ground and step away from it." The larger of the two men, young heavyset, with the look of someone who had been hired for this specific task and was now regretting his professional choices, took a step back. The second one, smaller, faster in his eyes, looked toward the door, toward Charlotte. She did not move. She looked back at him steadily, and he looked away first. "Who sent you?" Thomas said. Still quiet. Still entirely without heat. Neither man answered. "You were going to burn my barn," Thomas said. "With horses inside. That's a criminal matter in this territory, regardless of who told you to do it. The man who gave you the order will not be standing next to you when you explain that to a sheriff." He paused. "But if you tell me who sent you right now, I have no reason to involve a sheriff at all." The smaller man looked at the larger one. Something passed between them. Then the larger one said in a voice that had gone very young, "Kendrick, Frank Kendrick. He works for Caldwell." Thomas nodded once. "Leave the bottle. Walk to the road. Don't come back." They went. Charlotte stood aside and watched them pass, and when their footsteps faded across the yard, she let out a breath she'd been holding since she'd seen the bottle on the ground. Pete appeared in the barn doorway, rifle in hand, looking at the departed men and then at Thomas. "How long have you been awake?" he said. "Since they came through the gate." Thomas picked up the bottle carefully and set it on the shelf. "I heard the latch." "You didn't wake me." "I didn't need to." He looked at Charlotte. "She woke first." Pete looked at Charlotte with an expression that combined respect and slight offense. "My room is closer to the yard." "You snore," Charlotte said. Pete opened his mouth and closed it. Thomas moved to check the horses. All of them unsettled, ears pinned the way. Animals got when they'd smelled fear near them. He went down the line methodically, voice low, one hand on each neck, until the restlessness began to ease. Charlotte watched him do it. She watched the way he moved through the barn with the particular steadiness of a man who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, and who had internalized that lesson so completely he no longer had to remind himself of it. It lived in the way he moved, in the way he'd spoken to those two men, not with threat, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew how the situation was going to resolve. "Frank Kendrick," she said when he came back to her. "Do you know him?" "He manages Caldwell's eastern properties, handles the physical aspects of persuasion." His jaw tightened. "He's the one who told the Hargreave family their fences had been cut by other ranchers. He started a dispute that nearly turned into a shooting. It was manufactured start to finish to make the Hargreaves willing to sell. And now he's sending men to burn barns. Now he knows the letter I sent Voss included evidence that could destroy the assessment scheme. Someone told him." Thomas paused. "Which means Caldwell has someone watching the postal office in Harlow Crossing." Charlotte felt the implication land. She had mailed the letter herself. She had been seen. "He knows I'm involved." "Yes." "Does that change anything for you?" He looked at her. "Does it change anything for you?" She considered it for exactly 1 second. "No." "Then it doesn't change anything for me either." Pete had been listening to this exchange with the expression of a man watching two people realize something about themselves and choosing not to interfere with the process. He coughed diplomatically. "I'll keep watch the rest of the night." "I'll take the second half," Thomas said. "I'll make coffee at 4, Charlotte said. Pete looked at both of them. "All right then," he said, as though everything had been settled, which in its own quiet way it had. By morning, Thomas had written a full account of the attempted arson, detailed, dated, signed by all three of them as witnesses, and Charlotte had drafted a letter to the county sheriff in Pueblo, and a separate letter to Harlan Voss. The sheriff's letter was factual and procedural. The letter to Voss was something else it connected. Frank Kendrick to Richard Caldwell placed the arson attempt in the context of the ongoing fraud scheme, and asked Voss to determine whether Kendrick's activities constituted criminal conspiracy under territorial law. She was sealing the letters when Thomas came into the kitchen and read over her shoulder. He read without speaking until the end. Then, criminal conspiracy, not just civil fraud. If Kendrick is acting on Caldwell's direct instruction and we have 2 witnesses who will identify Kendrick's name, then yes. What happened last night wasn't a civil matter. She looked up at him. Caldwell crossed a line. We should make sure Voss knows that. Thomas straightened. If we push for criminal charges, it becomes public. The whole situation becomes public. It was going to become public the moment the governor's office authorized an audit. She held his gaze. Thomas, you've been fighting this privately for 3 years. You have enough to fight it publicly now. The question is whether you're willing to. I was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she'd learned to read. Not hesitation, but calculation. He was mapping it out, running the implications forward, the way he ran everything forward, looking for the points of failure. If it goes public, he said, everything goes public, including the extent of the land holdings. She held his gaze steadily. I know. That changes things. For the valley. For the families who've been working land that technically still has Reed name attached to legal structures. They'll need to know anyway, she said. If an audit exposes the full picture, you're better served controlling how that information comes out rather than having it discovered. She paused. Tell them yourself, before Caldwell can use it. Something shifted in his expression. She had said the thing he'd been circling. You mean tell the valley, he said slowly. The neighboring ranchers, the families. I mean call them together. Here. Tell them what Caldwell has been doing. Tell them what you've been doing. Show them the evidence. Let them understand what this fight is and why it matters. She paused. You've been protecting people who didn't know they were being protected. Give them the chance to stand beside you when it counts. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Vera Calloway. Start with Vera. Charlotte agreed immediately. She has the trust of every family in this valley. If she stands with you, others will follow. He nodded slowly. I'll ride to her this afternoon. We'll ride to her this afternoon, Charlotte said. He didn't argue. Vera Calloway listened to everything without interrupting. She sat in her parlor with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving between Thomas and Charlotte as the full story unfolded: the assessment fraud, the Pueblo records, Martin Briggs Voss's letters, the arson attempt, and the nature and extent of Thomas's true landholding. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Thomas and said, I knew Elias Reed. Thomas looked at her. I was a friend of my father's, Vera said. He told my father once that the only thing worth building in this territory was something that would last after you were gone. He meant the land. She paused. But he also meant the people on it. She looked at Charlotte. How long has she known? A few days, Charlotte said. And she's still here. She's the one who suggested coming to you, Thomas said. Vera studied Charlotte with that frank, assessing gaze. Then she nodded a single decisive nod, the kind that closed doors on doubt. When do you want people here? She said. 4 days, Thomas said. Saturday evening. Enough time to get word to everyone, not so much time that it reaches Caldwell first. It won't reach Caldwell, Vera said flatly. I'll make sure of that. She stood, signaling the meeting was concluded on her terms. Thomas, your grandfather would be proud of you. She paused. He'd be prouder of this. She nodded toward Charlotte. Thomas said nothing, but Charlotte saw his throat move. They rode back in the early evening, and the conversation between them on that ride was different from any they'd had before. Easier. Somehow the way a road feels different once you've walked it in both directions. They talked about Elias, about Vera's father, about small things, whether the cold would break before November, whether Pete's organizational system could be salvaged or needed to be rebuilt entirely from the ground up, whether Charlotte had eaten enough at lunch. She laughed at that last question genuinely fully, and the sound of it surprised her by how natural it had become. Thomas looked at her sideways. What? You noticed I didn't finish my biscuit. You never leave biscuits. I was distracted. By what? She looked at him. By you, Thomas. By all of this. She paused. By the fact that 3 months ago I was sitting in a house in Boston that no longer felt like mine, and now I'm in the middle of a land fraud case in Colorado, fighting a man who tried to burn our barn, and somehow that feels more like my life than anything I've ever done before. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a good thing? He said. She looked at the road ahead. Yes, she said. I think it is. I didn't say anything else. But he rode closer beside her for the rest of the way home, close enough that their knees occasionally touched, and he didn't adjust away, and neither did she. Saturday came with the particular clarity of a Colorado autumn day, sharp-edged and cold and enormously blue, and by 2 in the afternoon, there were 11 families gathered in Thomas's yard, which had never held that many people at once in the years Pete had worked there. Pete had built a fire, and Charlotte had made enough food to anchor the gathering to something warm and human. And Thomas stood at the center of it, with his grandfather's record book in one hand and the organized stack of documentation in the other. And he told the truth, all of it. He told them about Caldwell's scheme, the assessor, the manipulated records, the manufactured disputes, the sequence of purchases. He told them which families had been targeted and how. He told them what the Pueblo records showed and what Harlan Voss had filed with the governor's office. He told them about the attempted arson 2 nights ago and the name Frank Kendrick. And then he told them about his land, the silence. When he laid out the full picture of the Reed holdings was the particular silence of people reconfiguring a reality they had believed they understood. Charlotte watched their faces, the ranchers, their wives, a few older children who had been allowed to stay. Shock on several. Recalculation on others. On a few something that looked like relief, as though a suspicion they hadn't dared to voice had just been confirmed and turned out to be benign. One man, older, heavyset, a rancher named Gustavo Reyes, whose family had been in the valley 20 years, said, "You've been holding that water access all this time. You could have sold it, developed it." "Yes," Thomas said. "Why didn't you?" Thomas looked at him. "Because the water is why all of you can stay here. The moment that access gets consolidated in one man's hands, it becomes leverage. It becomes a weapon." He paused. "My grandfather understood that. I've tried to honor it." Gustavo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from us?" And that was the Charlotte had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it, the moment when everything Thomas had built in silence became something collective. When the one-man fight became a valley's fight. She stepped forward. "Sworn statements," she said. "From every family Caldwell approached. Every conversation, every pressure tactic, every artificially low offer written out and signed. If we're building a criminal conspiracy case alongside the civil fraud challenge, we need a pattern. Individual incidents are anecdotes. 11 families describing the same methodology is evidence." She looked around the yard. "We also need anyone who has documentation letters from Caldwell or his agent's assessment notices, any written communication. All of it. We're building a case that Harlan Voss can take into a federal court if necessary." A woman near the back, young with a child on her hip, said, "What if Caldwell finds out we're cooperating? What happens to our places?" Charlotte looked at her directly. "The governor's audit is already filed. Caldwell can't stop it now without drawing more attention than he can afford. He needs quiet to operate. What we are doing right now is the opposite of quiet." She paused. "The safest thing any of you can do is make sure this case is so visible and so well documented that moving against any of you becomes too costly. His weapon has always been that none of you knew the whole picture. Now you do." The woman looked at her, then looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "She's right." The gathering lasted until almost dark. By the end of it, Charlotte had collected 8 signed statements, 3 sets of documentation, and the particular look on Thomas's face when he watched her work. A look she kept seeing out of the corner of her eye, and kept making herself not examine too closely, because there were more important things to focus on. She told herself that with enough conviction that she almost believed it. She sent the package to Harlan Voss the following morning. It went out thick and heavy, the weight of 11 families' testimony in her hands, as she passed it across the postal counter, and she looked at the clerk and said pleasantly, "I'd like a receipt for this, please," in a tone that made clear she was aware he might be watching and wanted him to know she was watching too. He gave her the receipt. She put it in her pocket and walked out. 3 days later, Caldwell's response arrived, and it was not in the form of a letter. It was in the form of a man. He came to the ranch himself, which none of them had expected. Richard Caldwell in person. Charlotte had not seen him before, and she took him in quickly as he dismounted in the yard. 50s, well-built, the particular kind of handsome that had once been genuine and had since become cultivated. He wore a coat that was expensive in a way designed to be noticed, and carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had not been told no in a very long time. He looked at Charlotte first, then at Thomas. "Mr. Reed." His voice was warm, and considered the voice of a man in a negotiation. He believed he was winning. "I thought it was time we spoke in person." "You've been speaking through your men for weeks," Thomas said, "including the 2 you sent to burn my barn." The warmth in Caldwell's expression didn't flicker. That told her everything a guilty man would have reacted. Caldwell simply absorbed the accusation and moved past it with the comfort of someone who had lawyers for exactly that purpose. "I don't know anything about that," he said pleasantly. "Unfortunate business if it happened." He looked at Charlotte again. "You must be Mrs. Reed." "I am," she said. "Your husband has been making things rather complicated recently," he said. "I came to see if there wasn't a simpler path forward." "There is," Charlotte said. "Withdraw your offer to purchase this property, cease your campaign against the neighboring families, and resign whatever influence you have over the county assessor's office before the governor's auditors find it for you." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. The warmth in his expression thinned slightly. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I think you may not fully understand." "She understands completely," Thomas said. "We both do." He held Caldwell's gaze with a flatness that had no anger in it, and was more dangerous than anger precisely because of that. "You came here to see how much we knew, and whether there was a softer option than fighting the audit. There isn't. We have your assessor's altered records. We have Martin Briggs's documentation of the original Reed land grant. We have 11 sworn statements from families you've pressured. And we have a Denver attorney who filed a criminal conspiracy inquiry with the territorial prosecutor's office yesterday." Something moved behind Caldwell's eyes. Fast and controlled, but Charlotte caught it. She had been watching for it. "Yesterday," she repeated quietly. "Harlan Voss filed the criminal referral on Wednesday, which means it is already in the territorial prosecutor's hands, which means this conversation is the last one we need to have." She paused. "Because everything after this is a legal matter, and we're quite comfortable in legal matters." Caldwell stood very still. He was not a man who was accustomed to having the ground removed from under him, and he was taking a moment to find his footing. She could see him calibrating what he had, what they had, what the cost-benefit of different responses looked like. He looked at Thomas. "This will take months, years maybe. Are you prepared for what that costs legally, financially?" "Yes," Thomas said, simply, without heat. "Your wife seems very confident," Caldwell said, with the particular edge of a man making a point of referring to a woman as a possession in order to diminish her. Thomas said nothing. Charlotte noticed he didn't look at her when Caldwell said it the way a man looks at something fragile to check if it has been damaged. He didn't look because he already knew the answer. She was not fragile. He knew that. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you should go. You have a great deal to discuss with your own attorneys." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he put his hat back on, remounted his horse and rode out of the yard without saying anything else. The 3 of them, Charlotte, Thomas. Pete watched him go. Pete said, "Think he'll fight it?" "Yes," Thomas said. "But it'll cost him more than he's willing to spend if the criminal referral holds." He looked at Charlotte. "Yesterday, you knew Voss filed yesterday." "I received a telegraph in town this morning," she said, "while I was mailing the Briggs confirmation letter." She pulled the folded telegraph message from her coat pocket and held it out. He took it, read it. His face was very quiet. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I wanted you to have it to use," she said. "In the room, real time. If you'd known it an hour ago, you might have led with it. Leading with it would have told him the extent of what we had before he showed us the extent of what he intended. She paused. He came here to read us. I wanted to let him read what we chose to show. Thomas looked at the telegraph, then at her. He said, Charlotte. She waited. I owe you. He stopped. Started again. I don't know how to... He stopped again. Thomas Reed, who had never once in her presence struggled for words, stood in his own yard at a complete loss for them. She took the telegraph back from his hand. She folded it and put it in her pocket. You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. This is my home. These are my people too now. That's not debt, that's just how it works. He looked at her. Pete coughed and walked away with the specific tactfulness of a man removing himself from a moment that didn't belong to him. Thomas said, I need you to know something. She waited again. When I wrote the first letter, he said slowly, I told you I had nothing impressive to offer. He held her gaze. I told you that because it was true in the ways I was afraid of, the ways that mattered to me. I was afraid that if someone came here and found only what looked like a failing ranch and a stubborn man with a record book, they'd leave. A pause. I was afraid of what I'd feel if they left. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Nobody's leaving, she said. The words were simple, but the way he received them, the way his posture shifted fractionally, as though he'd been holding something rigid for a very long time and had finally set it down, said everything about how long he had been waiting to hear them. She turned toward the house because she could feel something building in her chest that she was not yet ready to let out in a yard in broad daylight, where Pete was almost certainly still watching from around the corner of the barn. She had 2 steps on the porch when Thomas said, Charlotte. She looked back. Howe was still standing where she'd left him. He was looking at her with that expression, the unguarded one she'd first seen across a kitchen table by lamplight, and had been trying not to think about too carefully ever since. He said, I'm glad it was you who wrote back. She stood on the porch step and let that land where it needed to land. In her chest, where the things that mattered actually lived. So am I, she said. She went inside. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, just past the door, where no one could see her through the window. And she stood there with her hand over her heart, and let herself feel the full weight of it, all of it. Everything that had accumulated in the weeks since she'd arrived on a stagecoach with a carpet bag, and a determination that had felt in the beginning more like defiance than hope. It was not defiance now. She wasn't entirely sure what it was. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was built on something solid, on 12 weeks of shared work and honest words, and a man who had told her the truth about his limitations before she arrived, and then proceeded to be immeasurably more than he'd claimed. She pushed off the wall. She put on the kettle. She sat down at the kitchen table with Harlan Voss's letters and the case documentation and the list of follow-up items that still needed handling, because there was still work to do, and she was the kind of woman who did it. But her hand when she picked up the pen was steadier than it had been in years. Caldwell was not finished. They all knew that. The criminal referral would take time. The audit would take time. He had money and connections, and the patience of a man who had built an empire on other people's fear of exactly how long these things could drag on. But something had shifted. Not in the legal case in the room where the legal case would ultimately be decided. The valley was no longer a collection of isolated families, each fighting alone. And Thomas Reed was no longer a man carrying an enormous weight in the dark. And Charlotte Reed, who had come west on a train, because a stranger's letter had told her the truth, had found out that what she'd thought she was walking into, and what she'd actually walked into, were 2 very different things. She had thought she was escaping a life that was too small. She had walked into the middle of something that was going to ask everything of her. She picked up her pen and began to write. The letter from the Territorial Prosecutor's Office arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Caldwell had ridden out of the yard with his hat on and his jaw set, and the particular silence of a man who had not yet decided whether to fight or retreat. Charlotte opened it before Thomas came in from the barn. She read it twice, standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on. Then she set it down exactly where he would see it, and put the kettle on and waited. He came in 4 minutes later. He saw the envelope. He looked at her face. Good or bad, he said. Read it. He picked it up. She watched him read, watched the stillness of his face, the way his eyes moved down the page with the controlled focus of a man who had trained himself not to react to information until he had processed all of it. He reached the last paragraph. He read it again. Then he set it down. They accepted the referral, he said. They accepted the referral, she confirmed. The prosecutor's office has opened a formal criminal investigation into Richard Caldwell and Frank Kendrick for conspiracy to commit fraud and criminal intimidation. She paused. Harlan Voss's office will be contacted for evidentiary cooperation within the week. Thomas stood at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the letter, and Charlotte saw something move through him, slow and deep, like a current running under still water. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. The particular release of a man who had been braced for a long time against something enormous and had just felt for the first time the pressure begin to ease. 3 years, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The families. I'll ride to Vera this morning. She'll get word to everyone before dark. Charlotte poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of him. Sit down, Thomas. He sat. He picked up the cup. He looked at the letter. It's not over, he said. No, it's the beginning of the legal process, which will be long and uncomfortable, and will require a great deal of patience from everyone involved. She sat across from him. But the dynamic has changed. Caldwell is now the man under investigation. The burden has shifted. She paused. He can't make quiet purchases while a prosecutor is watching him. He can't pressure families while an audit is documenting his methods. Whatever he tries to do from here, he has to do it in the open. And men like Caldwell don't do well in the open. Thomas looked at her across the table. How do you know so much about men like Caldwell? She held his gaze. Because my father defended 3 of them, she said quietly. Before he understood what he was doing. Before he looked at what it cost the people on the other side of those cases and couldn't keep doing it anymore. She paused. That's when he lost the practice. He stopped taking the cases that paid and started taking the ones that mattered. By the time I was 16, we were managing on very little. She looked at her coffee. I used to resent it. I understand it now. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. You've never told me that. You've never asked. I should have asked. She looked up at him. Something in his face had the quality it sometimes got in the early mornings. Open, unguarded, the way people looked before they'd had time to arrange themselves for the day. You were busy telling me things, she said. We were working up to it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then quietly. What else haven't I asked? She thought about it seriously, the way she took all his questions seriously. Whether I miss Boston, she said. Whether I regret coming. Whether there are things I wish were different. Do you, he said. Miss it. Regret it. She considered the honest answer, because Thomas deserved the honest answer. She thought about the house on Maple Street that would be sold by winter. About Gerald and his gray wool suit. About the life that had been offered to her in Howard Pratt's dining room, comfortable, sufficient entirely without risk. She thought about the woman who had sat at a dead man's kitchen table and opened a letter from a stranger, and felt for the first time in years that someone was speaking to her in a language she actually understood. I miss my father, she said. Not Boston, my father. She paused. And no, I don't regret it. She looked at him steadily. Not one day of it. He nodded once. Slow. The kind of nod that meant something was being received and held, not just acknowledged. What do you wish were different? He said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had told her in his first letter that he had nothing to offer but honesty, who had turned out to be the most consequential person she had ever known, who had spent years carrying other people's fights in silence and hadn't once asked anyone to notice. I wish you'd told me sooner, she said. About the land, about Voss, about what you've been doing in this valley for 3 years. She kept her voice steady. Not because it changes anything, because you shouldn't have been carrying it alone, and I was here. I was right here. His jaw moved. He set down his cup. I know, he said. And the two words held the weight of everything he hadn't said for a very long time. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had done that deliberate that plainly, and she felt him go very still beneath her hand, not pulling away, just absorbing the way he absorbed everything that mattered carefully, completely. We're not doing that anymore, she said. Carrying things alone. He turned his hand over under hers. He held it. No, he said. We're not. They stayed like that for a moment. That was long enough to matter. Then Charlotte picked up her cup, and Thomas picked up his, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet of the kitchen, and outside. Pete was already starting on the morning feed, and the ranch sounded the way it sounded every day. Horses and wind and work, and it was ordinary, and it was entirely enough. She rode to Vera Calloway's within the hour. Vera read the prosecutor's letter with the focused attention she gave. Everything, her expression controlled and careful. And when she reached the end, she set it on her table and was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said, Elias would have shouted. She looked at Charlotte. Thomas didn't, did he? No. He never does. Vera stood. I'll have word to every family by sundown. Will you be at the ranch tomorrow? People will want to come. We'll be there, Charlotte said. I'll have food. Vera looked at her for a long moment. You came here from Boston, she said. You didn't know this valley. You didn't know these people. You had no reason to fight this fight. Charlotte looked back at her. I had every reason, she said. They're my people now too. Vera nodded, slowly, with a satisfaction that reached all the way back to some private conviction she had been holding since the first day Charlotte had sat across from her in that parlor and answered her questions without flinching. Good, Vera said. Go home. There's work to do. There was. There was a great deal of work to do, and the weeks that followed were the hardest sustained labor Charlotte had ever performed. Not physical, though that was present too, but the grinding, meticulous labor of documentation and coordination and legal correspondence. She worked with Harlan Voss remotely through letters and the occasional telegraph, building the evidentiary record that the prosecutor's office needed. She worked with the Valley families, collecting and organizing their statements into a coherent chronological record. She worked with Thomas, who handled the strategic and relational dimensions of the fight, while she handled the documentary and legal ones, and who had the particular quality of a good partner. He never duplicated her efforts, never undermined her decisions, and never once made her feel that her work was auxiliary to his. Voss came to the ranch in person in late October. Charlotte had expected a Denver attorney to look like a Denver attorney, polished, formal, the kind of man who wore his profession on the outside. Harlan Voss was 60, compact, with a face like a man who had heard every possible lie and found them all equally uninteresting. He shook Thomas's hand, then Charlotte's, and he looked at her and said, The Pueblo Addendum. That was your work. Yes. It's the best piece of evidentiary construction in this file. He said it the way he might say the weather was clear as a simple observation. Where did you study? I didn't, she said. My father was an attorney. He taught you well. He showed me the work, she said. I taught myself. Voss looked at her for a moment longer than professional assessment required. Then he turned to Thomas. She's an asset. Use her properly. Thomas looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Voss. He does, she said. They spent 2 days working with Voss, reviewing the complete file, identifying the strongest arguments, anticipating Caldwell's defensive strategy. Caldwell had hired 2 attorneys from Denver and 1 from back east, which Voss noted without apparent concern. They're expensive, and they're good, he said, but they're working with a client who did what he did, and that is an insurmountable problem for any attorney, regardless of their fee. On the second evening, after Thomas had gone to check the livestock and Pete was in the barn, Voss sat in the kitchen with Charlotte and said, How long have you been married? 4 months, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He told me about the letters, before you arrived. He looked at his coffee. He said he had found someone who answered questions honestly, and he wanted to know if she would come. He paused. I told him that was an extraordinary thing to stake a marriage on. What did he say? Voss looked up at her. He said all marriages are a stake. This one was at least honest about it. A pause. He was right. Charlotte looked at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat across from Thomas on her first night and made biscuits because it was the only ground she knew to stand on. 4 months. It felt like 4 years in the way that mattered, and like 4 days in the way that didn't. He was right, she agreed. The winter that pressed in through November brought the case to its first major resolution. The governor's audit completed in full produced findings that the Territorial Land Office described in the careful language of official documents as systematic manipulation of assessment values, affecting 17 properties across a 4-year period. The county assessor was removed from office. An associate of Caldwell's in the county clerk's office resigned before he could be removed. Frank Kendrick was arrested on the last day of November in the town of Del Norte on charges of criminal intimidation and conspiracy to commit arson. He gave a statement to the prosecutor's office within 48 hours of his arrest. Charlotte read about it in a letter from Voss and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "He named Caldwell directly." "Directly and specifically," Thomas said. He was reading the same letter from across the table. "Dates, instructions, amounts paid." He set the letter down. "It's over for Caldwell. He can fight the civil case for years, but the criminal exposure is too large. His attorneys will negotiate." "When?" "Voss says the negotiation has already started." Thomas looked at her. "He wants to avoid trial, which means he'll concede the civil claims to get the criminal ones reduced. The families get their remedies. The properties that were fraudulently assessed get corrected. The purchases he made under coercion get unwound where possible." Charlotte thought about the Hargreave family, about the young woman at the gathering with the child on her hip who had asked what would happen to their place, about all of them 11 families who had sat in this yard in autumn sunlight and listened to Thomas Reed tell them the full truth and decided to stand with him. "The Hargreave property," she said. "Can it be unwound?" Voss thinks yes. The sale was made under documented financial duress created by the fraudulent assessment. There's a legal mechanism. Thomas paused. "It'll take time, but yes." She pressed her lips together, nodded once. "Good," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who cried easily and would not start now over a kitchen table, she stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard for a moment at the fence Thomas had repaired before she arrived, and the well with the old rope pulley, and the barn where 2 men had stood with a glass bottle and a singed rag and intended the worst. She breathed. "Charlotte," Thomas said behind her. She turned. How was standing, not sitting. He had crossed the kitchen while she was at the window, and he was closer than she expected, and his face held the open quality that she had learned to recognize as the version of him that didn't have a careful layer over it. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I told you once that I needed to know if you would stay when there was nothing impressive to see." He held her gaze. "That's not entirely true. Or it was true when I wrote it, but it was the fearful version of what was actually true." He paused. The pause had the quality of a man choosing his words with the same care he chose everything not for effect, but because he meant them. "The actual truth is that I wanted someone I couldn't impress. Someone who would see the work and the land and the record book, and not the idea of what it was worth, but the actual thing itself." He paused again. "I found that. I found you. And I didn't know how to tell you that the finding was the most important thing that had happened to me in a very long time, because I didn't want to put weight on something before I knew what it could hold." Charlotte looked at him. "Thomas," she said, "you built a life that protects people. You kept your grandfather's record. You fought for 3 years for families who didn't know they were being fought for. You wrote a letter to a woman you'd never met and told her the truth about everything difficult before you told her anything easy." She held his gaze. "I knew what I was walking into. I knew it from the first letter. I just didn't know the size of it." She paused. "The size of it doesn't change what I knew." He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. Then he reached out and put his hand against her face. One hand careful, the way he was careful with everything, and he kissed her. It was not a dramatic gesture. It had no performance in it. It was the kiss of a man who had decided something and was acting on it, which was exactly how Thomas Reed did everything that mattered. When he pulled back, he looked at her with the expression she had no longer any desire to translate into simpler terms. She understood it. She had understood it for some time. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, in the same voice he used to tell her the truth about difficult things, because for Thomas Reed, there was only one way to say anything that was real. She looked at him, at this man who had worn out his boots and patched his elbows and picked wildflowers for a windowsill, and quietly held a valley together while pretending to be nothing more than a struggling rancher with an old barn. "I know," she said. "I love you too." A pause. "I've known for a while." "How long?" She thought about it. "Pueblo," she said. "When you looked at the ledger discrepancy and then looked at me, and the first thing you said wasn't 'well done,' or 'I never thought of that.' The first thing you said was, 'This is enough.' Because you went straight to what it meant for the people it would help." She paused. "That was when I knew." He looked at her for a moment. "That was 6 weeks ago." "Yes." "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it yet," she said. "And I'm not a woman who says things before people are ready to receive them." Something moved across his face, something that was half exasperation and wholly tender. He pulled her in and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen of the house that was theirs in every way that mattered. The house with the listing porch and the old well and the barn where Pete was probably pretending not to know what was happening and were still. It was the kind of still that meant something was settled. Not finished, not perfect, not without the long road of the legal case ahead of them and the season's work, and all the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of two people building a life in hard country. But settled in the place that counted, the place underneath all the rest of it, the foundation that everything else would rest on. She felt him breathe. She breathed too. Outside. Pete walked past the kitchen window, whistling an entirely unconvincing impression of a man who had noticed nothing. Charlotte laughed against Thomas's shoulder. He made a sound that she had never heard from him before, low and genuine, the laugh of a man who had forgotten somewhere in the long, serious work of being Thomas Reed that he was allowed to find things funny. She filed it away with the wildflowers and the coffee on the stove, and the first ledger left on the kitchen table. Spring came slowly to the San Luis Valley, the way it always did, reluctantly, then all at once. The legal proceedings moved at the pace. Legal proceedings moved, which was not fast, but they moved in the right direction. Caldwell's attorneys negotiated through January and February. By March, the settlement framework was in place, the fraudulent assessments corrected across all 17 properties, the coerced sales subject to review and reversal, where documentation supported the claim. Caldwell's expansion plans in the Southern Valley legally enjoined pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings against Kendrick. Caldwell himself did not go to trial. His attorneys arranged a resolution that required him to divest several properties, pay restitution into a fund for affected families, and accept a permanent bar from holding or acquiring land in the Colorado Territory. It was not a prison sentence, and Charlotte acknowledged with the pragmatism she'd learned from years of watching her father work, that it was probably the best outcome available under the actual law. But he was finished in this valley. Finished everywhere in the territory. The name Caldwell, which had moved through the San Luis Valley like a quiet threat for 3 years, stopped meaning anything to be afraid of. Harlan Voss sent a final letter in April that was 3 paragraphs long, which for Voss constituted an effusive communication. He confirmed the settlement. He confirmed the criminal disposition of the Kendrick matter. And in the last paragraph he wrote, "The evidentiary record in this case was the most thorough I have worked with in 30 years of practice. I trust you know where to direct that observation." Thomas read the letter and handed it to Charlotte without comment. She read it and handed it back. "He means you," Thomas said. "He means both of us," she said. He looked at her. "Charlotte." "Thomas." He shook his head slowly, but he was, and this was still not an entirely common occurrence, smiling. The real version. The one that reached his eyes. The ranch that spring was different from the ranch Charlotte had arrived at in the dust of late summer. Not the buildings. Those were the same, and Thomas had no interest in renovation for its own sake, a preference she had entirely adopted. But the feeling of the place had changed. The yard that had been quiet and isolated had become somewhere people came. The Reyes family, the Hargreaves, when they came back to reclaim their property. Vera Calloway, with reliable frequency Pete's cousin, who had come from New Mexico and asked to hire on for the season. Martin Briggs rode out from Del Norte in April to return the documents Charlotte had organized and kept all winter. He stayed for supper and spent most of it talking to Pete about the best sources for harness materials in Del Norte, and when he left, he shook Thomas's hand and looked at Charlotte and said, "Your father would have been something if he'd had you helping him." She felt that one for a long time. In May she wrote to Gerald. Not with explanation or justification, she had nothing to justify. She wrote to tell him she was well, that the ranch was prospering, that she hoped he and his family were in good health. She mentioned Thomas, without elaborating. She did not mention Howard Pratt. Gerald wrote back in June. He was not gracious, he was not built for gracious, but he was not unkind, and he said somewhat painfully, "You appear to have landed on your feet. I did not think you would." She read it, folded it, and set it in the small cedar box where she kept her father's letters. Thomas found her sitting at the window that evening with the box on her lap, not reading anything, just holding it. "Gerald," he said. He says I appear to have landed on my feet." Thomas sat beside her. Not across, not at a distance beside her, the way he sat now, the way he had learned or allowed himself or simply become. "Did you?" he said. She looked at the yard, the fence in good repair, the horses in the corral, Pete crossing with feed and a complaint on his lips for someone. The barn standing solid. The well. The east-facing window upstairs where she'd stood on the first night, looking at 2 yellow wildflowers in a glass jar, and understood without having words for it, yet that she was somewhere real. "Better than that," she said. He put his arm around her. She leaned into it. He was warm and solid, and entirely present the way he was present at everything fully, without reservation, with the same commitment he gave to the record book and the water rights and the 11 families who had gathered in this yard and found out that someone had been watching over them all along. One evening in late May, they sat on the porch as the light went long and golden over the ridge. Thomas with his coffee, Charlotte with hers. The comfortable silence between them that had traveled all the way from the first uncomfortable silence of her first night and become something entirely different. Below them, the valley spread wide and green from the spring water, the creek running full through the eastern pasture, feeding everything south of the ridge, exactly the way Elias Reed had understood it would, exactly the way Thomas Reed had spent 3 years making sure it continued to do. Thomas said without looking away from the horizon. "What did you think? When you first saw the ranch?" She considered the honest answer. "I thought it was poorer than I'd imagined," she said. "And I thought I had made the bravest decision of my life getting off that stagecoach anyway." He was quiet. "Were you right?" "About which part either?" She looked out at the valley, at the creek light on the eastern pasture, at the land that had been here before Elias Reed and would be here after all of them, and that asked only to be worked honestly and held carefully and passed on to the next person with the same integrity it deserved. "You were exactly what your letters said you were," she said. "And I was right to come." She paused. "I just didn't know that the man who told me he had nothing impressive to offer was the most extraordinary man I'd ever meet." She looked at him. "I should have known. The unimpressive ones always are." Thomas looked at her with the open face he wore now, the one that wasn't careful or layered or held at a distance, and he said, "I didn't know what I was waiting for. Not exactly. I knew the shape of it. Someone who answered honestly. Someone who wasn't afraid of hard things. Someone who could look at what I had and see what it was instead of what it was worth." He paused. "I didn't know it would be someone who could take my case file and make it better than I could, or ride to Del Norte in cold weather without a complaint, or look at Richard Caldwell in this yard and dismantle him in 3 sentences." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know she would make me feel like this ranch was finally finished." Charlotte held those words the way she held everything. He gave her carefully, completely, knowing the weight of them. "It's not finished," she said. "It's just starting." He smiled. "The real one." "Yes," he said. "It is." The light went slowly off the ridge, and the valley held the last of it, the way valleys do, deeply fully keeping what the day had given, long after the day itself had gone. Thomas Reed and Charlotte Reed sat on the porch of a house that had known one generation of hard work and was now beginning another. And the record book was inside on the kitchen table, with a new entry in new handwriting. And the creek ran through the eastern pasture, the way it had always run, and the ranch was quiet with the particular fullness of a place that knows exactly what it is. She had not come west to find wealth. She had come west to find something real. She had found a man who was rich in the only ways that lasted: in integrity, in loyalty, in the quiet and absolute courage of someone who did right things without needing anyone to see him do them, and who had been waiting without quite knowing it for the one person who would look at all of it and choose to stay. She had stayed, and in the staying, she had found that what she thought she was escaping had been so much smaller than what she had walked toward this land, this man, this life that was hers. Now in every way that a life can belong to a person who has finally stopped being afraid to claim it. That was the whole truth of it. The kind that didn't need explaining or dressing up or making larger than it was. It was enough. It was everything. It was real.